The smell of stale coffee and cheap cigars hung heavy in the air of the Black Hawk County Land and Realty office. It was the smell of bad deals and forced smiles. Eli Vance, all of 24 years old, but with eyes that looked twice that age, stared at the deed on the desk. The paper was crisp, the ink a stark, final black. Outside, the July sun of 1970 beat down on the pavement of Cedar Falls, Iowa, making the heat shimmer in waves. Richard Sterling, the man behind the desk, leaned back in his creaking leather chair. His suit was a size too tight, his tie knotted like a noose, and his smile was as wide and shallow as the Cedar River in August. He ran a thick, ringed finger along the edge of the document. "Last chance to change your mind, son," Sterling said, his voice a low, condescending purr. "For $150 an acre, you're buying yourself 160 acres of heartache. The old Miller place ain't been worth a damn since the topsoil washed into the creek back in the 30s. Eli didn't look up. He just uncapped his fountain pen, the one his father had carried through the Pacific in the Second War. He dipped the nib in the inkwell on Sterling's desk, a deliberate, steady motion. "It's what I can afford," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Afford?" Sterling chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Kid, you came back from Vietnam with a chest full of medals and a GI Bill in your pocket. You had that inheritance from your grandfather. You could have walked into the First National Bank, leveraged that, and put a down payment on a real piece of ground, a half section of that black dirt south of town. Get yourself a new John Deere 4020, a 4-bottom plow. Start farming in the 20th century. He gestured vaguely out the window toward the future he was selling. "Instead, you're buying a rock farm. You'll be lucky to pull 40 bushels of corn an acre out of that clay. You'll be out there on that old Farmall M of your dad's, breaking your back for pennies while your neighbors are buying new combines." Eli's hand didn't waver as he signed his name, Eli Vance. The ink bled slightly into the paper, a permanent stain. He pushed the deed back across the desk. He could feel Sterling's pity, sharp and insulting as a slap. To men like Sterling, a man was measured by the size of his monthly payment to the bank. Debt was a tool, a sign of ambition. To Eli, who had seen men pay the ultimate price for the decisions of others, debt was a chain. "The Farmall runs fine," Eli said, wiping the nib of his pen with a small cloth. "And I won't owe the bank a dime. The land will be mine. The tractor is mine. What I make is mine." Sterling shook his head, the smile finally vanishing, replaced by a look of genuine disbelief. "You're an idiot, Vance. A sentimental fool. That kind of thinking died with your grandfather. This is 1970. It's go big or go home. You're choosing to go home before you even start." He stamped the deed with a heavy, final thud, the sound echoing in the small office. "Congratulations, you own the most worthless parcel in Black Hawk County." Eli stood, his worn denim jacket feeling stiff in the air-conditioned chill. He nodded once, a curt dismissal, and walked out, the little bell over the door tinkling behind him. He didn't look back. He climbed into his truck, a 19x38 Chevrolet Apache 3100. Its seafoam green paint was faded to a pale ghost of its former self, with rust creeping along the wheel wells like a slow infection. But Eli knew every bolt and wire on that truck. He'd rebuilt the 235 straight-six engine himself, machining the head and seating the valves with his own hands. It turned over with a familiar, throaty rumble, a sound more reassuring to him than any banker's promise. He drove west out of town, the windows down, the hot Iowa air rushing in. He passed the sprawling John Deere factory, a monument to modern agriculture. He passed implement dealerships with gleaming new green and red tractors lined up like soldiers on parade, their price tags bearing more zeros than he'd ever had in his bank account. He saw farmers he knew, men his father's age, driving by in new Ford pickups with air conditioning, their faces grim with the stress of the loans they carried. Finally, he turned onto a gravel road, the tires crunching over the stones. He pulled up to a rusty gate, held shut with a loop of barbed wire. This was it. His land. He got out and leaned against the warm fender of the Apache, the engine ticking as it cooled. Sterling was right in a way. The front 40 acres sloped gently, but the soil was pale and thin. Rocks, ranging from the size of a fist to the size of a hay bale, littered the landscape. Beyond that, the land fell away sharply into a tangle of scrub oak and cottonwood that bordered a swampy, mosquito-infested creek bottom. It was ugly, forgotten land. He could hear the distant roar of a big diesel tractor from his neighbor to the south, probably a new international harvester, 10-6, turning over rich black soil with a 5-bottom plow, covering acres in the time it would take Eli to fix a busted shear pin. He felt a pang of doubt, a cold whisper that maybe Sterling was right. Maybe he was a fool, clinging to an outdated code in a world that had moved on. Now, before we get into the sweat and the struggle of the next decade, I have to ask you all, have you ever had someone in a position of authority, someone in a suit and tie, tell you your dream was foolish? Tell you that your old-fashioned way was bound for failure? Let me know down in the comments, because Eli Vance was about to hear that from just about everyone in the county. He stood there, alone, with nothing but a paid-for deed and the monumental task of turning a rock patch into a life, and the chorus of doubt was just getting started. The first year was a lesson in the physics of hard ground and the limits of old iron. Eli's primary tractor was his father's 1948 Farmall M, a machine born in an era of 50-cent-a-bushel corn. Its narrow front end and tall, steel-spoked wheels were designed for cultivation, not for breaking new, unforgiving ground. The engine, a C248 four-cylinder gasoline, put out a respectable 36 horsepower at the drawbar, but it groaned and smoked under the strain of pulling a 2-bottom John Deere plow through the rocky clay. His days started before sunrise, with the taste of black coffee and the smell of grease on his hands. He'd check the oil in the Farmall, a thick, dark SAE 30. He'd top off the radiator, open the petcock on the bottom of the gas tank to drain any water from the sediment bowl, and give the grease fittings on the plow's coulters a shot from his hand-pump grease gun. The ritual was a meditation, a communion with the machine. The work itself was brutal. He'd set the plow, drop it into the ground, and let out the clutch. The Farmall would dig in, the rear tires clawing for traction, the engine's RPMs dropping as the load came on. He'd steer with the brake pedals as much as the wheel, navigating the endless minefield of rocks. Every few yards, the plow would hit a buried stone with a sickening jolt that shot up the steel frame and into Eli's bones. Sometimes the plow would just ride up and over. Other times, it would stop the tractor dead in its tracks. And then, one sweltering afternoon in August, it happened. He hit a big one, a granite boulder hidden just beneath the surface. The tractor lurched to a halt, the engine nearly stalling. There was a loud, sharp crack, like a rifle shot, and the right plowshare went limp, dragging uselessly in the dirt. He killed the engine, the sudden silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic pounding of his own heart. He climbed down and saw the problem immediately. The shear bolt, a piece of soft steel designed to break under extreme stress to save the plow frame, had done its job. But the impact had been so severe it had also cracked the cast-iron frog, the main bracket that held the plowshare assembly. For most farmers, this would mean a trip to town, a new part ordered, days or even a week of downtime. For Eli, it was a disaster. He didn't have the money for a new frog, and he didn't have the time to waste. The planting window for winter wheat was closing. He unhitched the plow and dragged it back to the dilapidated barn that served as his workshop, using a chain hooked to the Apache's bumper. Inside, amidst the clutter of old tools and spare parts his grandfather had saved, was a forge. It was a simple brick and clay affair, with a hand-cranked blower. It hadn't been used in 20 years. He spent the rest of the day cleaning it out, patching the clay with mud from the creek bank, and hooking up the blower. The next morning, he laid a fire of hardwood charcoal and began the painstaking process of repair. He heated the cracked frog until it glowed a dull cherry red, the heat shimmering in the dim barn. Using a ball-peen hammer and a set of drifts, he carefully hammered the crack closed. Then came the hard part. Brazing. He heated the area again, this time with a focused oxyacetylene torch he'd bought at a farm auction. He applied flux, which hissed and bubbled, cleaning the metal. Then he touched a brass brazing rod to the glowing seam. The brass flowed like liquid gold, wicking into the crack through capillary action. He built up the bead slowly, carefully, ensuring a strong bond. The air filled with the sharp, metallic smell of burning flux and hot iron. When he was done, he buried the entire piece in a bucket of dry sand to let it cool slowly, preventing it from becoming brittle. While the frog cooled, he fired up the forge again. He found a piece of high-carbon steel from an old truck's leaf spring. He heated it, hammered it on the anvil, the ringing clang echoing off the barn walls, and shaped it into a new, stronger shear bolt. He knew it was a risk. A bolt that was too strong wouldn't break, and the next time he hit a rock, the entire plow frame might pretzel. But it was a risk he had to take. He quenched the finished bolt in a bucket of used motor oil, the hot steel hissing and throwing off a plume of acrid smoke. 2 days after the breakdown, the plow was back together. The brazed joint was ugly but strong. The new shear bolt was fitted. He hitched it back to the Farmel M, took a deep breath, and went back to work. Word of his struggle got around. The talk at the Cedar Falls Co-op was not kind. Men in clean overalls and seed corn hats would lean against the counter, drinking pop from glass bottles, and talk about the Vance kid. Heard he's trying to weld that old junk plow back together, one would say, shaking his head. Kid's got more stubbornness than sense. Should have listened to Sterling, another would add. My boy just got a line of credit for a new 4430. Sound guard cab, air conditioning, radio. Says it's like farming from an armchair. Meanwhile, Eli's out there eating dust and breaking his back for nothing. Sterling himself was often there, holding court. He'd bought the old Henderson farm, a prime piece of flat black earth, bordering Eli's property to the west. He was farming it with hired hands and brand new equipment, a walking advertisement for the gospel of debt and expansion. It's a shame, Sterling would say, loud enough for everyone to hear. The boy's got a good work ethic, I'll give him that. But he's trying to fight a war with a muzzle loader. You can't make a living on 160 acres of scrub, not anymore. Not with that kind of equipment. Eli heard the whispers. He felt the stares when he went to town for supplies. He was an outcast, a living relic. His first harvest confirmed their predictions. The corn was stunted, the ears small. He harvested it himself with a used one-row corn picker he'd bought for $200. Another relic. His yield was 52 bushels an acre. His neighbors, on their rich, pampered soil, were pulling in 130. After selling his meager crop, paying for fuel and seed, he had barely enough left to get through the winter. That winter was long and cold. He patched the roof of the tiny, drafty farmhouse with tar and tin. He lived on canned beans, potatoes from his small garden, and the occasional rabbit he shot in the woods. To make ends meet, he took on repair jobs, tuning up tractors, and welding broken equipment for the very men who mocked him. They paid him, but their eyes held a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. He was their cautionary tale. The fool on the hill, farming rocks. He spent his nights reading old agriculture manuals by the light of a kerosene lamp, learning about soil chemistry, crop rotation, and soil conservation. He was fighting a war, all right, not against progress, but against his own land. And he was determined to win it, one rock, one busted part, one bushel at a time. As the early 70s bled into the middle of the decade, a strange kind of fever swept through the American heartland. It started in Washington, with Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz telling farmers to plant fence row to fence row. It was fueled by massive grain sales to the Soviet Union, a deal that sent corn and soybean prices skyrocketing to levels no one had ever seen. Inflation was taking off, but for farmers, it felt like a golden age. Land values doubled, then tripled. The banks, eager to cash in, were practically giving money away. The mantra was simple: leverage your assets, buy more land, buy bigger machines. Get big or get out. Richard Sterling became the high priest of this new religion. He was no longer just a realtor. He was a land baron. Using his initial holdings as collateral, he borrowed heavily and bought up 2 more farms, creating a contiguous block of over 1,000 acres of the best ground in the county. His farmstead, built on a rise that overlooked the entire valley, including Eli's ragged patch, was a monument to 1970s prosperity. A sprawling brick ranch house with a 3-car garage and a massive machine shed that looked like an airplane hangar. He traded his Cadillac for a new Lincoln Continental Mark IV, a land yacht the color of champagne. His flagship tractor was now an International Harvester 14666, a beast of a machine with a turbocharged diesel engine that bellowed across the fields. Its cab was a space-age bubble of tinted glass, complete with air conditioning, an 8-track tape player, and a padded seat that hissed with compressed air. From this climate-controlled throne, Sterling, or more often his hired men, could plough, plant, and harvest in absolute comfort, listening to John Denver while the world outside baked in the sun or froze in the cold. He was the embodiment of the boom, a man who had bet big on the future and was winning in spectacular fashion. Occasionally, Sterling would drive his Lincoln down the gravel road past Eli's place. He'd slow down, the electric window gliding down, and just look. He'd see Eli, covered in grease and sweat, wrestling with his old equipment. He wouldn't wave or say anything. He'd just shake his head with a slow, pitying smile and glide away in a cloud of dust and superiority. Eli watched the boom with a deep-seated caution. He heard the talk, saw the new pickups and combines, felt the pressure to join the party. The banker who held the mortgage on his father's old farm before it was paid off even called him. "Eli, your land's value has gone through the roof. We could refinance, get you a line of credit for $250,000, easy. Time to expand, son. Everyone's doing it." Eli politely declined. He remembered his grandfather's stories, told on the porch during quiet summer evenings. Stories of the 1920s, when everyone was getting rich on paper, borrowing against land that was guaranteed to go up in value. And then the crash, the foreclosures, the proud men who lost everything because they owed the bank more than their land was worth. "Never bet the farm, Eli," his grandfather had said, his voice a low rumble, "because one day the bank will call your bluff." So Eli stayed his course. He worked, he saved, he poured every spare penny and every ounce of sweat back into his 160 acres. The rocks he'd pulled from the fields were used to build up the creek bank, preventing erosion. He'd built a small but sturdy herd of Hereford cattle, a tough breed that could thrive on the rough pasture in the back 80. Their manure wasn't waste, it was treasure. Every winter, he'd spread it on his fields, slowly, painstakingly, building up the thin soil, giving it life. His yields crept up. 52 bushels became 65, then 75. It was still a pittance compared to the massive harvests Sterling was pulling in, but it was progress. It was his. By 1976, after 6 years of relentless work and frugal living, he had saved up $4,000. It was a fortune to him. He didn't go to the bank. He went to a farm auction. And there, sitting among the rusted-out hay rakes and worn-out balers, was a John Deere 4010 diesel. It was a 1963 model, traded in by a farmer upgrading to a new Soundguard cab tractor. The green paint was faded and peeling, the seat was torn, and one of the rear tires was mismatched. But to Eli, it was beautiful. It had a 6-cylinder engine, 80 horsepower, power steering, and a synchro-range transmission. It was twice the tractor the Farmel M was. He bid carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. When the auctioneer's gavel finally fell, it was his. $4,000. Cash. The other farmers watched him, some with amusement, some with a shake of the head. "Still buying our hand-me-downs," one of them muttered to his neighbor. They didn't see a man making a smart, debt-free purchase. They saw a man falling further and further behind the times. Driving the 4110 home was one of the proudest moments of Eli's life. The powerful roar of that 6-cylinder diesel engine was the sound of his own independence. He spent the next month tearing it down in his barn, replacing the seals, grinding the valves, rebuilding the injection pump. He gave it a new coat of paint, not because it needed to look pretty, but out of respect for the machine. With the 4010, he could pull a 3-bottom plow. He could work his land faster, more efficiently. He was still a small-timer, a joke to men like Sterling, but he was building something real, something that belonged to him and him alone. As the 1970s began to wane, however, a new kind of talk started to filter through the static on the AM radio. News reports from faraway places spoke of an oil embargo, of revolution in Iran. There were pictures in the paper of cars lined up for blocks to buy gasoline. The word inflation was no longer a sign of prosperity, but a threat. And a man named Paul Volcker was appointed to run the Federal Reserve, promising to slay the inflationary dragon with a weapon nobody in the heartland truly understood: interest rates. The letters from the banks started to arrive in his neighbors' mailboxes. Polite at first, they mentioned adjustments to their variable rate loans. The prime lending rate, which had been in the single digits for years, crept into the double digits. 12%, 15%. At the co-op, the mood began to shift. The confident swagger was replaced by a nervous tension. The talk was no longer about new tractors, but about the rising cost of fuel, fertilizer, and, most terrifyingly, the cost of money itself. One evening, Eli sat on his porch, watching a line of dark, bruised-looking clouds build on the western horizon. A storm was coming. He could feel it in the air, a heavy electric stillness. He looked out over his fields, the young corn standing green and healthy in the fading light. He looked at the barn, where his paid-for tractors sat silent. He thought of Richard Sterling in his big house on the hill, with his fleet of new machines and his mountain of banknotes. Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It wasn't fear. It was something else. A grim, quiet certainty. For 7 years, they had all called him a fool. He was beginning to wonder if being a fool was the only thing that was going to save him. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the cottonwood trees, and the first distant rumble of thunder echoed across the valley. The first sign of the turning point wasn't a letter from a bank or a drop in the commodity markets. It was the sky. The summer of 1979 had been a scorcher, the sun a merciless anvil hammering the moisture out of the earth. The corn in Eli's fields, though healthier than in years past, had begun to curl its leaves during the heat of the day, a thirsty plant's silent scream. Richard Sterling's fields, irrigated with a massive center pivot system he'd financed, were still a perfect uniform green, a testament to what money could buy. Then, in early August, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of oppressive silence that precedes violence. Eli was in his barn, grinding the valves on a neighbor's farm all H, when the barometric pressure dropped so fast it made his ears pop. He stepped outside and saw it. A shelf cloud rolling in from the west, a churning, malevolent wall of darkness that swallowed the horizon. He had just enough time to get his cattle into the lee of the barn and chain the big doors shut when the storm hit. It wasn't rain, it was ice. Hailstones, first the size of peas, then marbles, then golf balls, hammered down with the force of a shotgun blast. The sound on the barn's tin roof was a deafening, continuous roar, like 1,000 hammers pounding at once. Through a crack in the door, Eli watched in horror as his fields were shredded. Green leaves were stripped from their stalks, the tender ears of corn battered and bruised. In 15 minutes, a season's worth of work was beaten into the mud. When the storm passed, an eerie silence fell. The sun came out, glinting off the ice that carpeted the ground. Eli walked out to his fields. The devastation was absolute. His crop was a total loss. He stood there, the cold mud sucking at his boots, and felt a familiar, metallic taste of despair. But beneath it was something else, a bedrock of resolve. His crop was gone, but his land was still his. His machinery was in the barn, safe. He had no loan payment due on the 1st of the month. He would survive. He looked west, toward Sterling's property. The storm had been indiscriminate. Sterling's 1,000 acres of perfect corn were just as shredded, just as ruined. The difference was, Sterling's crop wasn't just a potential profit. It was collateral. The next day, the second blow fell. President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. The commodities market, which had been the foundation of the farming boom, collapsed overnight. The price of corn plummeted by nearly $1 a bushel. Any farmer who had been counting on high prices to cover his massive loans was suddenly facing a catastrophic shortfall. The talk at the co-op turned from nervous to funereal. Men with faces like grey stone stared at the tumbling numbers on the ticker tape. Richard Sterling was there, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a pale, sweaty sheen. He was on the phone, shouting at a broker in Chicago, his voice cracking with desperation. A week later, Eli saw the dealer's service truck parked in Sterling's driveway. The big International 1466 was sitting silent in the field, its hood open. One of Sterling's hired hands, a young man named Dave, stopped by Eli's place later that day to borrow a wrench. "What happened to the big International?" Eli asked, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Dave shook his head, his face grim. "Threw a rod right through the side of the block. We were trying to get the chopper hooked up to salvage what we could of the corn for silage. Now it's just sitting there." Sterling called the dealer. They said a new short block, plus labor, is going to be north of $10,000. He didn't take it well. $10,000 was more than Eli had made in the last 2 years, combined. For Sterling, who had just lost his entire cash crop and was facing a margin call from his broker. It was a death sentence. The cracks were no longer just showing. The entire foundation of his empire was beginning to crumble. Eli watched the service truck leave Sterling's farm a few days later, the big red tractor still sitting in the field, a silent, crippled monument to the high cost of progress. Sterling couldn't even afford to fix the machine he needed to salvage the wreckage of his harvest. The fool on the hill, meanwhile, fired up his old John Deere 40s-10, hitched up his sickle-bar mower, and began cutting what was left of his own corn for cattle feed. It wasn't much, but it was something, and it cost him nothing but fuel and time. The winter of 1980 was a long, cold funeral for the American family farm. The Federal Reserve, in its war on inflation, pushed the prime interest rate to an unthinkable 21%. For farmers like Richard Sterling, who had built their empires on variable-rate loans, it was like being caught in a flash flood. The friendly letters from the bank were replaced by stark, legal notices printed on grim, grey paper. Payment due. Past due. Notice of default. The auction notices began to appear in the county newspaper, tacked to the bulletin board at the co-op like obituaries. First, it was the young guys, the ones who had jumped in head first at the height of the boom. Then it was the established families, farms that had been passed down for 3 generations, their names now listed under forced liquidation. Every sale was a grim spectacle. Neighbors gathered in somber silence, their faces etched with the terrifying thought, "Am I next?" They watched as lifetimes of work, tractors, combines, tools, even household furniture, were sold off to the highest bidder. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant, a merciless drumbeat of ruin. Eli's repair business, however, had never been better. Farmers who couldn't afford a $500 part from the dealer would bring their broken machinery to him. He'd fire up the forge, heat, hammer, and weld, bringing old iron back to life for a fraction of the cost. He didn't take much cash. He knew no one had any. He bartered. A welded plough frame for half a hog. A rebuilt carburetor for a winter's worth of firewood. He became a vital cog in the community's desperate struggle for survival, his old-fashioned skills suddenly more valuable than a line of credit at the bank. His barn, once a symbol of his backwardness, was now a beacon of hope, its lights often burning late into the night. The ring of his anvil, a sound of defiance against the crushing silence of failure. The notice for Richard Sterling's auction appeared in late March of 1981. It was the biggest sale the county had ever seen. A full page in the paper, listing everything. The 1,000 acres of prime bottomland, the brick ranch house, the Lincoln Continental, the fleet of new equipment. And there, on the list, was the International 1466, needs engine work, a final pathetic admission of defeat. Eli went to the auction. He didn't go to gloat. He went to bear witness. The crowd was enormous, a mix of somber neighbors and vulture-like investors from the city, smelling blood in the water. Richard Sterling stood near the auctioneer's truck, a ghost of the man he once was. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was gaunt, and his eyes were hollow, darting around, but seeing nothing. He had lost everything. The land, the house, the dream. He was a king surveying the public dismemberment of his kingdom. Eli watched as the big-ticket items went first. The new combine sold for half its value to a corporate farm consortium from Des Moines. The massive tillage equipment went for pennies on the dollar. The Lincoln Continental, the symbol of Sterling's untouchable success, was bought by a local scrapyard owner. Each fall of the auctioneer's gavel was a nail in the coffin of Sterling's ambition. Then they came to the land, sold off in parcels. The prime sections, the flat black earth, were snapped up by the same investors. Finally, they came to the last parcel, 80 acres, which included the house, the big machine shed, and the original farmstead that bordered Eli's own property. The bidding was sluggish. The house was too big, the taxes too high for most of the local farmers who were just struggling to hold on. The bidding stalled at a number that was shockingly low. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, his voice straining. "Folks, this is a beautiful home, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Silence. Sterling closed his eyes, his face ashen. He was about to become homeless. Then a voice cut through the quiet. "I'll bid," it said. Everyone turned. It was Eli Vance. He stood at the back of the crowd, his hands in the pockets of his worn denim jacket. He looked calm, resolute. A murmur went through the crowd. The fool on the hill, the man who farmed rocks. Eli made his bid, a number he had carefully calculated. For 10 years he had saved every dollar he could, living like a monk, pouring his life into his land. He had no debts. His savings, which had seemed a pittance during the boom years, were now a small fortune. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I have a bid. Do I hear another?" The investors looked at each other, confused. This parcel didn't fit their portfolio. They were here for the productive land, not a gaudy house and a machine shed. They shook their heads. "Going once," the auctioneer called out, looking at Eli. "Going twice." He looked at Sterling, who was now staring at Eli, his mouth slightly agape, a look of utter disbelief on his face. "Sold!" The gavel cracked, the sound echoing across the yard. To Eli Vance. The final act of Eli's vindication was not a confrontation, but a quiet conversation. A few days after the auction, after the papers were signed and the deed was filed, Eli walked over to the brick ranch house. Sterling was there, packing a few personal belongings into cardboard boxes, a man adrift. His family had already left for the city to stay with relatives. He looked up as Eli entered, his expression a mixture of shame and confusion. "Come to kick me out?" Sterling asked, his voice raspy. "Come to enjoy the view?" Eli shook his head. "No," he said simply. He held out a set of keys. "I came to make you an offer." Sterling stared at the keys. "What are you talking about?" "I don't need this house, Richard," Eli said. "It's too big, and I've got no use for that machine shed. I want you to stay, live here, rent-free for now. When you get back on your feet, we can work something out. A couple $100 a month, maybe. In exchange, you can help me keep an eye on the place." Sterling was speechless. He sank onto a cardboard box, his face in his hands. He had spent a decade pitying, mocking, and looking down on this man. He had used Eli as a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything that was wrong and outdated. And now, that same man was offering him a kindness he had never shown anyone, a grace he did not deserve. "Why?" Sterling finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything, why?" Eli looked out the big picture window, across the land he now owned, toward his own small house on the hill. "Because my grandfather taught me that the land remembers," he said. "It remembers who takes care of it, and who just uses it. And a community is like that too. We're all we've got out here, Richard. When a neighbor falls, you don't step on him. You offer him a hand up." That single act of compassion changed everything. The story of what Eli had done spread through the county faster than a prairie fire. The whispers at the co-op changed. The men who had called him a fool now spoke his name with a quiet reverence. He was no longer the outcast. He was the survivor, the one who had seen the storm coming when everyone else was admiring the sunshine. He had proven that wealth wasn't measured by the size of your tractor or the acreage on your loan documents, but by the calluses on your hands and the black ink in your ledger. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. Eli farmed his original 160 acres and the new 80, slowly nursing the overworked soil back to health. He never went into debt. He expanded his cattle herd. Richard Sterling stayed in the house, a quieter, humbled man. He tended a large garden and did odd jobs for Eli, the old arrogance replaced by a grudging and then genuine respect. The two men, once symbols of opposing philosophies, found a strange, unspoken peace. Eli eventually married a schoolteacher from town, and they raised 2 children in the small, sturdy farmhouse his grandfather had built. He taught his son, Daniel, how to weld, how to listen to an engine and diagnose its troubles by sound, how to respect the land and the machinery. He taught him the difference between cost and value. Then came the spring of 1995. Eli was 51 years old, his hair graying at the temples, his hands permanently stained with the earth and grease of his life's work. A dusty sedan with an out-of-state license plate pulled into his driveway. A man in a polo shirt and slacks got out, carrying a briefcase and a rolled-up map. He was a geologist. He explained that his company had been studying seismic survey data. The worthless rock farm, the scrubby, hilly land that Sterling had mocked, sat directly on top of a geological anomaly known as the Mid-Continent Rift System. The very rocks that had broken Eli's plows and his spirit for years were part of a deep, ancient basin that sometimes trapped pockets of oil and natural gas. Eli listened, his expression unchanging. He had heard too many promises in his life to get excited, but he gave them permission to drill an exploratory well, back in the swampy, wooded creek bottom he had never been able to clear. 3 months later, the drilling rig hit pay dirt. It wasn't a gusher, not the kind that makes overnight billionaires. It was something far more fitting for a man like Eli Vance. It was a small, steady deposit of high-quality crude oil, enough for a single pump jack to operate for decades. One cool autumn evening, Eli stood on the hill with his son, Daniel, now a teenager. They watched the setting sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Below them, the fields were resting, ready for winter. In the distance, the pump jack, which Eli had insisted be painted John Deere green, moved with a slow, rhythmic grace. Up and down, up and down. It was a quiet, steady, and dependable machine, pulling wealth not from a speculative market or a bank loan, but from the very rock and soil of the land itself. That realtor, Mr. Sterling, he told me this land was worthless, Eli said, his voice quiet. He said I was an idiot for buying it. Daniel looked at the pump jack, then back at his father. He was wrong, the boy said. Eli put a hand on his son's shoulder. He was wrong about the land, son. But he was right about one thing. It was a lot of heartache. The thing is, you can't be afraid of the hard work or the heartache. Sometimes that's where you find the real value, not just in the ground, but in yourself. The pump jack continued its steady rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat on the quiet land. It wasn't a sound of frantic speculation or borrowed prosperity. It was the sound of patience, the sound of perseverance. It was the sound of a sentimental fool who had bet on himself, and in the end had won it all.